Before you close your eyes tonight, before you pull that blanket up to your chin and let your thoughts begin to blur and slow, take just a moment, just one small moment. Because right now, at this exact second, you are doing something that human beings have been doing for hundreds of thousands of years. You are preparing for sleep. And yet, the way you are doing it, in a softly lit room, perhaps with a phone nearby, perhaps with the distant hum of a refrigerator or the muffled sound of traffic outside, is completely, utterly, historically strange. The world you are sleeping in tonight would be unrecognizable to nearly every human who has ever lived. The darkness they knew was absolute. The silence was deep and heavy in a way that almost no one in a modern city has ever truly experienced. The cold was real. The heat was earned. And the night stretched out long and full and strange in ways that we have almost entirely forgotten. So, before we go any further, go ahead and dim your lights, all the way down if you can. Turn on a fan if you have one nearby. Pull your blanket a little closer. Get comfortable. Make this feel like the environment it is meant to be. And if this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly one reason: to put you gently, historically, thoroughly to sleep. If you enjoy what you find here, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a like. It helps more people find their way here, and that genuinely means a lot. Now, drop a comment before you drift off. Tell me where in the world you are joining from tonight and what time it is there. Are you somewhere in the northern hemisphere where it is cold and dark and the wind is pressing against your window? Are you in the southern hemisphere where summer is warm and the nights are short? Are you in a city that never fully goes quiet, or somewhere so rural that the only sound outside is insects and wind? I love knowing where these words are traveling. Every comment is a small light on a map, and I read every single one. Tonight, we are going back. Not in a jarring or dramatic way, but slowly, the way history actually moves. We are going to sit with the people who came before us and ask one very simple question. How did they sleep? What did their nights feel like? What were they afraid of in the dark? And what did they find peaceful about it? What did they believe was happening while they lay unconscious and vulnerable and trusting in the night? You might assume the answers are simple. Surely people just fell asleep when the sun went down and woke up when it rose. Surely it was easier then. And in some ways, yes. But in other ways, the sleep of your ancestors was stranger, richer, more layered, and far more communal than anything most of us have ever experienced. It involved different rhythms, different fears, different rituals, and an entirely different relationship with darkness itself. Here is what strikes me most about all of this. The human need for sleep has not changed at all. For all of our technology, all of our artificial light, all of our alarm clocks and sleep trackers and white noise machines, your body, right now, is running on the same ancient biological rhythms as a medieval farmer in England, a Roman senator in his villa, a Bronze Age shepherd watching stars from a hillside in what is now Turkey. The need is identical, only the world around it has changed. So let us slow down together. Let your breathing soften. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. We are going to take a very long, very gentle walk through the history of human sleep. And somewhere along the way, if things go as they tend to go, you are going to drift off. That is not a failure of attention. That is the entire point. We will begin at the very beginning, before agriculture, before cities, before fire was fully understood, with the sleep of the earliest humans, People who had no beds, no walls, and no certainty about what waited in the dark. And we will move forward slowly, pausing to linger in ancient Egypt, in medieval bedchambers, in Roman bathhouses, in peasant cottages lit by a single tallow candle, in the long, cold winters of the pre-industrial world. There is no rush tonight. The night is long. History is patient. And the story of how human beings learn to close their eyes and trust the darkness is one of the most quietly beautiful stories ever lived. Let it settle around you like warmth. Let it carry you. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Just listen and breathe, and let the past wash gently over you. Long before there were houses, long before there were cities or kingdoms or even the concept of a permanent village, your ancestors slept on the ground. They slept beneath open skies, blazing with more stars than you will ever see in your lifetime. They slept close together in small groups, with the fire dying down at the center of camp and the sounds of the wilderness pressing in from every direction. Modern researchers who have studied present-day hunter-gatherer societies, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San people of the Kalahari Desert, have found that their sleep patterns are remarkably consistent, and they are also remarkably different from what we might expect. These communities do not go to sleep the moment the sun sets. Instead, the period just after sunset is a time of social warmth, talking, storytelling, tending the fire, watching the stars emerge one by one from a darkening sky. Sleep begins, on average, about 3 hours after sunset, once the temperature has dropped and the body has naturally begun to cool. And they do not wake with an alarm. They wake with light. The body, synchronized so deeply with the rhythm of the natural world, begins to surface from sleep gradually, organically, the way a diver rises slowly from depth. There is no jarring sound. There is no sudden electric brightness. There is the slow softening of darkness into gray. And the body, recognizing this in a way that goes beyond thought, begins to stir. The total amount of sleep in these communities tends to be somewhat shorter than what modern sleep science recommends, usually between 6 and 7 hours. But researchers believe it is denser, more consolidated, and more restorative than the fragmented sleep most modern people experience. Part of the reason is temperature. Without climate control, the natural cooling of night air triggers melatonin release in a way that our carefully temperature-regulated bedrooms do not replicate. The body sleeps better when it is allowed to cool. Your ancestors knew this not as science, but as simple experience. The cold night air was not something to be fought. It was an invitation. There was another element to early human sleep that we have almost entirely lost: the presence of others. Early humans did not sleep alone. They slept in tightly clustered groups, with bodies pressed together for warmth, with children tucked between adults, with the elderly sleeping more lately at the edges, and the young sleeping deeply in the center. Sleep was, for nearly all of human history, a communal act. Solitary sleep, closing a door, lying alone in a room with no other body nearby, is a modern invention, and a very recent one. The fire was central to everything. The control of fire, which dates back at least 400,000 years and possibly far longer, fundamentally changed the nature of human sleep. Before reliable fire, sleep was governed entirely by darkness. You slept when it was dark because darkness was dangerous. But fire pushed back the night. It created a circle of warmth and light that made it possible to stay awake after sunset, to talk, to craft tools, to pass knowledge from elder to child, to do the slow, patient work of being human long after the sun had disappeared. Around the fire in those earliest camps, something was happening that was not just biological, it was cultural. The stories told in those firelit hours, the knowledge shared, the songs hummed half-consciously while someone across the fire was already asleep. All of it happened in the soft overlap between waking and dreaming. Sleep came not like a door closing, but like a tide coming in, gradual and inevitable, and each person surrendered to it in their own time, while others kept vigil or drifted themselves. Then the fire would burn low, voices would soften. One by one, the members of the group would slip downward into sleep, some still murmuring, some already breathing in the slow, deep rhythm of unconsciousness. The children would already be gone. The young always fall first, and fall deepest. The last ember would glow. An owl might call from somewhere in the tree line. The stars would continue their slow wheel overhead, indifferent and magnificent. This is where your sleep story begins. Not in a bedroom, not in a house, not beneath an electric light, but out there, under an open sky, pressed close to other warm bodies, with firelight fading at the center and the whole dark night laid out above you. Something in your body still holds the memory of this, the reason a campfire makes you sleepy, the reason soft voices in the dark feel safe, the reason a slowly dimming light is more conducive to rest than a sudden darkness. All of that is ancient. All of that is encoded in your biology over hundreds of thousands of years, just like this one. You are not so different from those earliest sleepers. You carry them with you tonight. And as the room grows quiet, as your breathing slows, you are completing a ritual that stretches back further than language, further than farming, further than anything we call civilization. You are doing what humans have always done. You are letting the day go. You are trusting the dark. Move forward now, many thousands of years. The camps have become cities. The fire has become industry. We are in ancient Egypt, somewhere along the green rib of the Nile, in a civilization so old that it makes the Roman Empire look young. And we are going to think about how these extraordinary people understood the night and how they slept within it. Ancient Egyptians did not have a casual relationship with sleep. For them, the boundary between sleeping and waking was a threshold between two worlds, the world of the living and the world of the gods. Dreams were not random firings of an unconscious mind. They were messages. They were dispatches from the divine, delivered in the night to those whose minds had grown quiet enough to receive them. There was a god named Bes, a stocky, lion-headed dwarf deity whose specific job was to protect sleeping people, particularly children and pregnant women, from the demons who prowled the night hours. Images of Bes were carved into the headboards of beds, painted on the walls of bedrooms, tattooed on the thighs of dancers and mothers and midwives. He was the guardian of the vulnerable hours. He stood watch so that you did not have to. The beds of wealthy Egyptians were remarkable objects. They sloped gently from head to foot, the head being higher, and were made of wood inlaid with ivory and gilded with gold in the grandest examples. A carved wooden or stone headrest served in place of a pillow, elevating the head just enough to prevent it from touching the sleeping surface. To modernize, these headrests looked deeply uncomfortable, but they served a purpose. They kept the elaborate hairdo or wig of the sleeper intact through the night, and they elevated the head in a position believed to be favorable for receiving dreams. The poor slept differently, as the poor always have and always will. For most Egyptians, sleep happened on simple reed mats on the floor or on low platforms of packed mud brick. They slept in the clothes they wore during the day, wrapped in a linen sheet if they were fortunate, curled against other family members for warmth on the cool winter nights when the desert air dropped sharply after sunset. The temples had dedicated rooms called dream incubation chambers. A person seeking divine guidance about illness, about a decision, about what the future held, might fast for several days, perform ritual purifications, and then sleep in the sacred space, waiting for a dream that would carry the answer they needed. There exist papyrus texts that function as dream dictionaries, categorizing hundreds of different dream scenarios and what each one meant. Dreaming of a large cat was a favorable omen. Dreaming that your teeth had fallen out, a dream that still visits people today, was in ancient Egypt a warning that your relatives were conspiring against you. These texts were consulted the way we might consult a doctor. The dream was a symptom. The priest was the diagnostician. At night, the Egyptian cities fell quiet, but never entirely still. Temple priests kept time through the night by watching the movement of specific stars and would announce each hour with a bell or a call so that those whose religious duties required night vigils could orient themselves in the dark. The night was divided into 12 hours, as the day was, and each hour had a name and a presiding deity. The Egyptians believed that Ra, the sun god, traveled through the underworld during the night hours, passing through a series of gates guarded by serpents, doing battle with the great chaos serpent Apep, before emerging reborn and triumphant at dawn. Every single night, this cosmic drama was being waged. Every morning, the sunrise was not taken for granted. It was a victory that had to be earned. And the sleeping person was, in their small way, a participant in this nightly mystery, their own descent into unconsciousness, a private echo of the god's journey through the dark. There is something deeply settling about this, if you let it. The idea that the night is not simply an absence of day, but a place of passage and transformation and divine work. It gives the act of closing your eyes a weight and a meaning that we have mostly forgotten. The Egyptians were not afraid of the night because they had made it sacred. They had filled its darkness with gods and stories and purpose, and so sleep for them was not a retreat from the world. It was an entry into a deeper one. Let that thought settle over you now. The night around you is not empty. Something old and patient lives in it. And you are doing what the Egyptians did, what every person who has ever lived has done. You are surrendering to it, one slow breath at a time. From Egypt, let us drift westward and forward in time, into the world of ancient Greece and Rome. Two civilizations whose ideas about sleep were so sophisticated, so carefully reasoned, that some of them would not be fully validated by science for another 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks had a god of sleep named Hypnos, a word you will recognize as the root of hypnosis. He was the twin brother of Thanatos, the god of death, and the two of them were not considered particularly frightening. They were calm, quiet, necessary. They lived together in the underworld, in a cave through which the river Lethe, the river of forgetting, flowed with a sound like soft water over stones. Around the entrance to their cave, poppies grew in abundance. The symbolism was not subtle. Sleep is the small death, the nightly rehearsal for the permanent one, and there is nothing to fear in either. Greek physicians were remarkably thoughtful about sleep. Hippocrates, writing in the 5th century BCE, observed that the amount and quality of a person's sleep was one of the most reliable indicators of their overall health. He noted that excessive sleep and insufficient sleep were both dangerous. He observed that certain foods promoted sleep and others disrupted it, that eating a heavy meal close to sleep was problematic, that wine in small amounts could be a sleep aid, and in large amounts a sleep destroyer. These observations, made without any modern instruments, without any understanding of brain chemistry or circadian biology, are astonishingly accurate. Aristotle wrote an entire treatise on sleep and dreams, on sleep and sleeplessness, in which he attempted to explain the physiological mechanism of sleep. He believed that the warmth generated by digestion rose to the brain during sleep, causing consciousness to dim. He was wrong about the mechanism, of course, but he was right about the fundamental observation that sleep is connected to the body's daily cycle of activity and restoration, that it is not optional, and that it serves a vital purpose in maintaining the balance between waking effort and nightly recovery. In Rome, sleep took on a more social and architectural dimension. Wealthy Romans had dedicated bedroom spaces, the cubiculum, which were small, often windowless rooms designed specifically for sleeping, positioned deep within the house to minimize noise and light. The Roman day was divided into 12 hours of daylight regardless of the season, which meant that summer hours were long and winter hours were short, and the timing of sleep shifted accordingly throughout the year. Romans of means slept on beds called lecti, wooden frames strung with leather or rope, and topped with a mattress of wool or straw, sometimes covered with linen and goose down for the very wealthy. The bedroom was considered a private space, but privacy in the Roman sense was different from ours. A wealthy Roman might sleep with slaves stationed nearby, ready to respond to any need in the night. The total solitude that many modern people consider essential for sleep would have seemed not peaceful but alarming to a Roman aristocrat, an indication of poverty or disgrace. The Roman approach to rest also included the afternoon nap, the meditazione, which was taken seriously as a component of daily health. The hours around midday, when the sun was at its highest and the air its hottest, were considered unsuitable for exertion. Shops closed, courts recessed. The cities grew quiet in a way that would seem extraordinary to anyone who has visited Rome in the modern summer. Sleep was not only for the night, it was a rhythm woven through the day itself, honoring the body's natural dip in alertness that, as modern science has confirmed, occurs in most human beings between 1 and 3 in the afternoon. The Roman poet Ovid wrote about sleep as a gift, a mercy, a soft undoing of the day's difficulties. The philosopher Seneca, who was prone to insomnia and wrote about it with painful clarity, described the experience of lying awake in the dark as a kind of conversation with oneself, sometimes productive, sometimes torturous, but always revealing. He recommended a consistent bedtime, a quiet mind cleared of resentment before sleep, and moderate evening eating as conditions for reliable rest. He was, in other words, writing a sleep hygiene guide 17 centuries before the term was invented. What strikes me most about the Greek and Roman approach to sleep is their seriousness. These were not people who saw sleep as a waste of time, as an inconvenience to be minimized. They saw it as a pillar of health, a form of wisdom, and, in its dream state, a possible channel to truths that waking consciousness could not access. To sleep well was to live well. To neglect sleep was to court illness, irrationality, and a shortened life. Let their seriousness settle into you now. You are not wasting time by resting. You are doing something that the wisest minds of the ancient world considered among the most important acts of daily life. Close your eyes a little more. The Romans would approve. Now, we arrive in the Middle Ages, a period that most people picture as relentlessly dark and difficult, and which was certainly both of those things in many ways, but which also had a relationship with sleep that was, in one very specific sense, richer and more nuanced than almost any other era in history. The discovery that changed everything historians thought they knew about medieval sleep came from a researcher named Roger Ekirch, who spent over 2 decades combing through historical documents, diaries, court records, medical texts, literary works from medieval and early modern Europe. What he found, described in his landmark paper in 2001 and later his book At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, was evidence of a sleep pattern so different from our own that it initially seemed impossible. Medieval people, it appears, did not sleep in one long continuous block. They slept in two separate segments, divided by a period of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night. Ekirch found hundreds of references to this pattern across centuries of documents. People referred to their first sleep and their second sleep as naturally and matter-of-factly as we might refer to breakfast and dinner. The period between them, typically lasting 1 to 2 hours, was described in various documents as a time for prayer, for sex, for visiting neighbors, for tending to animals, for quiet reflection, and for interpreting the vivid dreams that tended to occur in the hours just after midnight. This pattern was not considered unusual or disordered. It was simply how nights worked. A person who lay awake between their first and second sleep was not suffering from insomnia. They were in the interlude, doing what the interlude was for. Medieval physicians wrote about this waking period as the ideal time to conceive a child, reasoning that both partners would be calm and well rested after their first sleep. Monks organized their prayer schedules around it, designating the hour of matins, which fell in this middle waking period, as a time of particular spiritual clarity. The medieval bedtime was early by our standards, without artificial light beyond candles and fireplaces, and with candles being expensive enough that most households could not afford to burn them for many hours. Darkness came quickly and sleep followed shortly after. Most working people were in bed by 8 or 9 in the evening. First sleep would last until roughly midnight, then the waking interlude, then second sleep until dawn. The bedroom in a medieval peasant's home was not a separate room at all. For the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, there was no bedroom. There was a single room in which the family ate, worked, and slept. The fire was at the center and sleep happened around it, on straw pallets on the floor, or on a low wooden platform built against the wall. Animals were often brought inside in winter, not only for the animals' protection from the cold, but because their body heat contributed meaningfully to the warmth of the room. The smell of this sleeping space would be extraordinary to a modern nose. Smoke, animal bodies, unwashed human skin, straw both fresh and rotting, the lingering odors of whatever had been cooked that day. But this was simply the smell of home, and the brain habituates to familiar smells so thoroughly that the people sleeping in this room would not have noticed it any more than you noticed a particular smell of your own home tonight. In wealthier households, the bed was a statement of status. A fine medieval bed could be the most valuable single item in a household, a heavy wooden frame with carved posts, hung with curtains on all four sides, those curtains serving not as decoration, but as insulation against the cold air of a stone room, as a barrier against drafts and insects, and as a small private space within a larger shared one. The bed curtains were closed at night, creating a soft, dark cocoon within which the sleepers were enclosed and, to some extent, protected. These beds were also not exclusively private. Guests shared beds as a matter of course. Inns had beds that held multiple unacquainted travelers sleeping side by side. Servants slept at the foot of their employer's bed or in trundle beds that rolled out from underneath it. The idea that a bed was a deeply personal space to be shared only with an intimate partner would have been foreign and perhaps slightly suspicious to a medieval person. Beds were shared because warmth was shared, and warmth was survival. Outside the bedroom, outside every window in every village and city of medieval Europe, the night was genuinely, profoundly dark. There were no street lights, no lit shop windows, no illuminated signs. On a narrow medieval street was darkness so complete that you could hold your hand before your face and not see it. People navigated by memory, by feel, by the distant glow of a lit window, by the sound of water in a canal or a horse in a stable. The dark was not an inconvenience, it was a presence. And so sleep in the medieval world was not simply the absence of waking. It was a full engagement with the night, a movement through it in two stages, with a quiet interlude in the middle during which the world was at its most still, its most strange, and perhaps, if you believed in such things, its most sacred. Let that slowness find you now. first sleep has begun. We have been speaking, so far, mostly of the peaceful aspects of historical sleep, the communal warmth, the firelit stories, the two-part rhythm of the medieval night. But honesty requires that we also speak of the fear, because for most of human history, the dark was not only quiet and restful, it was also genuinely dangerous, and the people who slept within it knew it. The fears varied by time and place, but some of them were universal. Fire was one. In a world where homes were made of wood and thatch, where cooking and heating were both accomplished with open flame, where the only way to extinguish a fire was with water carried by hand, the possibility of a house fire in the night was a constant background fear. Medieval and early modern households had strict protocols around fire management before sleep. Embers were banked carefully. The fire was never left entirely unattended. And yet, fires still happened with devastating frequency, sweeping through entire villages in the night. Illness was another fear. Without modern medicine, without antibiotics, without even a clear understanding of how diseases were transmitted, going to sleep was not always a reliable proposition. Fevers came on suddenly. Children who were healthy at dusk could be dangerously ill by midnight. Plague had swept through European populations repeatedly, and in its worst outbreaks, the experience of going to bed not knowing if you would wake, or if the people sleeping next to you would wake, was not a metaphor. It was a lived reality. The night was also the time of thieves, of brigands, of wolves and bears in the rural areas where most people lived. The walls of a medieval house were not particularly substantial. The locks were simple. The darkness that made it so hard to navigate was also ideal for those who meant harm. There were reasons that wealthy households had guards, that village gates were locked at night, that the night watchman existed as a civic institution in every town of any size. But beyond the practical fears, there were the supernatural ones, and these should not be dismissed as simple superstition. They were a coherent, internally consistent system for explaining things that genuinely happened in the night and had no other available explanation. Sleep paralysis, the experience of waking partially and being unable to move, often accompanied by a feeling of crushing weight on the chest and the sense of a threatening presence in the room, is experienced by a significant portion of the human population. Before it was understood neurologically, it needed an explanation. And so every culture on Earth, independently, arrived at one. Something was sitting on you. In medieval Europe, it was called the Mara, or nightmare. In African tradition, the spirit Ogun. In Japan, Kanashibari. In China, a ghost pressing the body. The names were different, the entity was different, but the explanation was the same. Something had come in the night, and it meant you ill. Across pre-industrial Europe, the hours between midnight and dawn were considered the time of greatest supernatural danger. Witches held their Sabbaths, the devil walked, spirits of the recently departed had not yet fully departed, and might return to trouble the living. The church offered prayer specifically for protection through the night. Compline, the last prayer of the day, was said directly before sleep and functioned partly as a petition for safe passage through the dark hours. The sign of the cross was made over the bed. Holy water was kept nearby. Protective herbs, rosemary, St. John's wort, were dried and hung by the door. These were not irrational behaviors. They were the entirely rational response of people who were genuinely uncertain what the night might bring, performing the protective rituals available to them in order to enter sleep with a sense of agency and safety. And the comfort they provided was real. The mind that has performed its protective ritual, that has said its prayer and made its sign and banked its fire, that mind is quieter, more settled, more able to release its grip on waking consciousness and slide into sleep. We still do versions of this if we are honest. The locked door checked twice, the phone alarm verified 3 times, the glass of water on the nightstand.
the specific arrangement of pillows. These are our rituals. They are different in their content, but identical in their function. They tell the anxious mind that precautions have been taken, that the environment has been made as safe as it can be, and that it is therefore permitted to let go. Let your mind receive that permission now. The door is locked. The world outside is doing what it does. You have done what you can do. And the night, for all its history of fear, is also simply this: a quiet, a darkness, a softness of sound and thought. You are safe. You can let go.
While Europe was navigating the fears and simplicities of the medieval night, another civilization was producing some of the most sophisticated medical and philosophical thinking about sleep the world had ever seen. We are going to pause in the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 8th through 13th centuries, and visit the scholars and physicians whose ideas about rest shaped medicine for generations on both sides of the world. The city of Baghdad, at its peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, was almost certainly the largest and most cosmopolitan city on earth. Its population numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Its library, the House of Wisdom, contained translations and original works in Arabic, Greek, Persian, and Sanskrit, a convergence of human knowledge without precedent. And within this extraordinary intellectual environment, sleep was studied with the same rigorous curiosity applied to mathematics, astronomy, and alchemy. The physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, produced in the early 11th century a medical encyclopedia called the Canon of Medicine that would remain the standard medical reference text in both the Islamic world and Europe for the next 500 years. His treatment of sleep occupies several chapters and is remarkable for its nuance. He categorized sleep as essential to health and recovery. He described the stages of sleep qualitatively, noting that early sleep tends to be deeper and later sleep lighter and more dream-rich. He wrote about the importance of sleeping position, recommending starting sleep on the right side, as was also the practice advised in Hadith, and about the dangers of sleeping on one's stomach, which he believed disrupted digestion and the movement of vapors through the body. Ibn Sina also wrote about the relationship between mental distress and sleep disruption with a clinical precision that feels entirely modern. He recognized that worry, grief, and excessive mental exertion could prevent the onset of sleep, and he recommended specific remedies: gentle exercise in the late afternoon, warm baths before bed, light evening meals, and the company of people one trusted. He understood, in other words, that the body and mind are a single system, and that preparing for sleep required attending to both. Islamic religious practice wove sleep into the fabric of the day in a very specific way. The 5 daily prayers created a structure that naturally regulated the sleep-wake cycle. Fajr, the dawn prayer, required waking before sunrise, establishing a consistent and seasonally varying wake time that kept the body synchronized with natural light. Isha, the night prayer, was performed after darkness had fully fallen, and after it, sleep was considered not merely permitted but strongly encouraged. The Prophet Muhammad was recorded as discouraging excessive late-night wakefulness, recommending sleep after Isha and waking for Fajr as the ideal pattern. This rhythm, early sleep, dawn waking, with the shape of the day structured around light and prayer rather than artificial schedule, kept the bodies of practicing Muslims closely aligned with the natural circadian rhythms that modern sleep science identifies as optimal. The religious structure was, inadvertently or by design, excellent sleep hygiene.
The Islamic scholars took dreams with great seriousness. In Islamic tradition, truthful dreams, ruya, were considered one of the remaining forms of divine communication after the end of prophecy. They were categorized as either true visions, ordinary psychological dreams reflecting the preoccupations of the waking mind, or disturbing dreams sent by the devil. The practice of seeking a meaningful dream, performing specific prayers before sleep with the intention of receiving guidance, was called istikhara, and it is still practiced today by Muslims around the world seeking clarity on an important decision. The bedroom itself in Islamic tradition was a space of particular sanctity and etiquette. There were prayers to be said upon entering it and upon leaving it. Certain behaviors were appropriate within it and others were not. The privacy of the bedroom was protected by Islamic law more rigorously than almost any other domestic space. It was considered deeply invasive and improper to enter another person's sleeping space without explicit permission, a principle codified in Quranic verse and taken seriously in daily life. What emerges from a study of sleep in the Islamic Golden Age is a portrait of rest that is simultaneously medical, spiritual, legal, and deeply human. These were people who took the management of their sleep seriously as an act of stewardship of the body that God had entrusted to them. Neglecting sleep was not piety or productivity, it was a failure of care. And sleep well managed, at the right time, in the right position, after the right preparations, was itself an act of gratitude. Carry that idea with you now. Your rest tonight is an act of care. It is not laziness or escape. It is maintenance of the only body you will ever have. Let that reframe the permission to close your eyes completely. You are not doing nothing, you are doing something ancient, important, and wise.
Not everyone slept when the village slept. Every community, in every era, had its people of the night. Those whose work required them to be awake when others were not, navigating the dark hours while the rest of the world lay still. The night watchman is perhaps the most familiar figure. In medieval and early modern European towns, the night watch was an institution of genuine civic importance. Watchmen patrolled the streets from sunset to sunrise, on a rotation that typically divided the night into 4 watches of roughly 3 hours each. Their duties were various. They checked for fires, reported suspicious behavior, ensured the gates were secured, and called out the hours at regular intervals so that citizens could orient themselves in the dark. Being a night watchman was not a prestigious occupation. It was largely the work of the poor, the old, and the otherwise unemployable. The pay was minimal. The conditions were uncomfortable, cold in winter, wet in rain, the hours long, and the company often solitary. And yet the night watch was essential. Without it, the risks of fire and crime and disorder that preyed on sleeping communities had no organized resistance. The watchman was a thin line between the sleeping city and the dangers that the dark enabled. Millers worked through the night. The grinding of grain was a continuous process that did not stop with the sun, and the miller, already a somewhat liminal figure in medieval life, associated with dishonesty and magic in equal measure, was a creature of the night as much as the day. The mill itself was considered a slightly uncanny place. It sat apart from the village, often near water, and its sails or wheel turned at all hours. People told stories about mills at night. The miller's peculiar solitude made him a figure of both suspicion and indispensable necessity. Bakers rose before dawn, long before dawn, in fact. The bread that was on tables by morning had been mixed and shaped and left to rise and then baked through the hours when the town was dark. The baker was awake at 2 and 3 in the morning, in the warmth of the oven, while the rest of the street was cold and silent. This was physically hard work.
The heat of the oven in summer was punishing, and the lifting of heavy dough loaves hour after hour was exhausting. But it had a particular quality of solitude and of ownership of a time that belonged to almost no one else. The baker knew the night in a way that the butcher and the blacksmith and the farmer simply did not. Sailors, of course, were among the most significant night workers in human history. The watch system aboard ships divided the crew into rotating shifts so that the ship was always manned and navigable regardless of the hour. A sailor's sleep, even in the best circumstances, was fragmented, shifted, and deeply disrupted from any natural rhythm. The night watch might run from midnight to 4 in the morning. The sailor assigned to it would sleep in pieces on either side of that shift, on a narrow hammock in a low-ceilinged and poorly ventilated below decks, amid the sounds of creaking timber and the movement of the sea. The sleep of sailors was, by necessity, extraordinary in its adaptability. The body learned to fall asleep quickly. There was rarely time to drift off slowly, and to extract maximum rest from whatever window of time presented itself. Sailors were famous for their ability to sleep in almost any conditions, on any surface, in any noise level. This was not a talent, it was a survival skill developed under necessity, the body doing what it has always done when faced with no other option: adapting. Midwives were another category of night worker whose role was particularly charged. Birth, historically, was dangerous, unpredictable, and happened at all hours. A midwife could be roused from sleep in the middle of the night to attend a labor that might last another 12 or 20 hours. She might return home to sleep for a few hours and be called again before she had fully recovered. The midwife's sleep was always provisional, always subject to interruption, always offered with the knowledge that it could be taken back. And yet, within these interrupted and fragmented nights, something developed in the people who lived them, a different relationship with consciousness. People who are regularly woken in the night, who move between waking and sleeping repeatedly, often develop a particular quality of presence, a kind of alertness that runs beneath exhaustion, a readiness to surface from sleep at a moment's notice without the shock that most people feel when woken abruptly. The midwife, the watchman, the baker, they lived in the dark and knew it in a way that the soundly sleeping farmer simply did not. We honor them tonight, in our comfort, in our uninterrupted dark. All the people who stayed awake so that others could sleep. All the hands that moved through the night hours doing necessary work. Their vigilance is part of the history of sleep too, the background condition that made civilian rest possible. Someone was always watching, someone was always awake, and the sleeping world leaned on them without knowing it, the way you lean on your own heartbeat, constantly, trustingly, and in almost complete unawareness. Not everyone slept when the village slept. Every community in every era had its people of the night, those whose work required them to be awake when others were not, navigating the dark hours while the rest of the world lay still. The night watchman is perhaps the most familiar figure. In medieval and early modern European towns, the night watch was an institution of genuine civic importance. Watchmen patrolled the streets from sunset to sunrise, on a rotation that typically divided the night into 4 watches of roughly 3 hours each. Their duties were various. They checked for fires, reported suspicious behavior, ensured the gates were secured, and called out the hours at regular intervals so that citizens could orient themselves in the dark. Being a night watchman was not a prestigious occupation. It was largely the work of the poor, the old, and the otherwise unemployable. The pay was minimal. The conditions were uncomfortable. Cold in winter, wet in rain, the hours long, and the company often solitary. And yet the night watch was essential. Without it, the risks of fire and crime and disorder that preyed on sleeping communities had no organized resistance. The watchman was a thin line between the sleeping city and the dangers that the dark enabled. Millers worked through the night. The grinding of grain was a continuous process that did not stop with the sun, and the miller, already a somewhat liminal figure in medieval life, associated with dishonesty and magic in equal measure, was a creature of the night as much as the day. The mill itself was considered a slightly uncanny place. It sat apart from the village, often near water, and its sails or wheel turned at all hours. People told stories about mills at night. The miller's peculiar solitude made him a figure of both suspicion and indispensable necessity. Bakers rose before dawn, long before dawn, in fact. The bread that was on tables by morning had been mixed and shaped and left to rise and then baked through the hours when the town was dark. The baker was awake at 2 and 3 in the morning, in the warmth of the oven, while the rest of the street was cold and silent. This was physically hard work. The heat of the oven in summer was punishing, and the lifting of heavy dough loaves hour after hour was exhausting. But it had a particular quality of solitude and of ownership of a time that belonged to almost no one else. The baker knew the night in a way that the butcher and the blacksmith and the farmer simply did not. Sailors, of course, were among the most significant night workers in human history. The watch system aboard ships divided the crew into rotating shifts so that the ship was always manned and navigable regardless of the hour. A sailor's sleep, even in the best circumstances, was fragmented, shifted, and deeply disrupted from any natural rhythm. The night watch might run from midnight to 4 in the morning. The sailor assigned to it would sleep in pieces on either side of that shift, on a narrow hammock in a low ceiling then poorly ventilated below decks, amid the sounds of creaking timber and the movement of the sea. The sleep of sailors was, by necessity, extraordinary in its adaptability. The body learned to fall asleep quickly. There was rarely time to drift off slowly, and to extract maximum rest from whatever window of time presented itself. Sailors were famous for their ability to sleep in almost any conditions, on any surface, in any noise level. This was not a talent, it was a survival skill developed under necessity, the body doing what it has always done when faced with no other option, adapting. Midwives were another category of night worker whose role was particularly charged. Birth, historically, was dangerous, unpredictable, and happened at all hours. A midwife could be roused from sleep in the middle of the night to attend the labor that might last another 12 or 20 hours. She might return home to sleep for a few hours and be called again before she had fully recovered. The midwife's sleep was always provisional, always subject to interruption, always offered with the knowledge that it could be taken back. And yet, within these interrupted and fragmented nights, something developed in the people who lived them, a different relationship with consciousness. People who are regularly woken in the night, who move between waking and sleeping repeatedly, often develop a particular quality of presence, a kind of alertness that runs beneath exhaustion, a readiness to surface from sleep at a moment's notice, without the shock that most people feel when woken abruptly. The midwife, the watchman, the baker, they lived in the dark and knew it in a way that the soundly sleeping farmer simply did not. We honor them tonight, in our comfort, in our uninterrupted dark. All the people who stayed awake so that others could sleep. All the hands that moved through the night hours doing necessary work. Their vigilance is part of the history of sleep too, the background condition that made civilian rest possible. Someone was always watching, someone was always awake, and the sleeping world leaned on them without knowing it, the way you lean on your own heartbeat, constantly, trustingly, and in almost complete unawareness.
Everything changed in the late 18th century, and it changed fast, faster than human biology could adapt, faster than social customs could absorb. The Industrial Revolution did not merely change how people worked, It fundamentally and in some ways permanently altered how human beings slept. Before we get there, let us acknowledge what made the change possible: artificial light. For most of human history, artificial light was expensive, inefficient, and dim. Tallow candles, which were the primary source of artificial light for most working people in pre-industrial Europe, produced a small, warm glow that was adequate for close work, but inadequate for illuminating a room. They were also expensive enough that most households used them sparingly, burning them only when genuinely necessary, and sitting in near darkness for much of the evening. Beeswax candles were brighter and cleaner burning, but considerably more expensive, reserved for churches, the wealthy, and special occasions. The oil lamp, in various forms, was used throughout the ancient world and continued in use through the medieval period, but oil was also a cost with a real impact on a household budget. The result was that for most of human history, when darkness fell, most people simply lived in the dark. And this darkness, as we have discussed, was not merely an inconvenience. It was a biological signal to the body. The day is over. Begin preparing for sleep. Then came the Argand lamp in 1780, a significantly brighter oil lamp. Then coal gas lighting, introduced in the early 19th century and spreading rapidly through European cities in the 1820s and 1830s. Gas-lit streets changed the character of urban nights entirely. Shops stayed open later. Theaters scheduled second and third performances. Coffee houses and taverns extended their hours. The city, which had historically gone dark and quiet after sunset, became a place that could sustain social and commercial life well into the night. And then came the factory. The factory is the central institution of the Industrial Revolution, and its relationship with sleep was from the beginning one of extraction and disregard. Working hours in the early industrial period were extraordinary by any modern standard. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of physical labor in a single day was not unusual. The bodies of workers, including children as young as 6 or 7 who were employed in textile mills and mines throughout the early industrial period, were pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. Sleep in these conditions was not a rich and meaningful engagement with the night. It was collapse, brief, necessary, and never quite sufficient. The crowding of industrial cities created sleeping conditions that would have been difficult even by the standards of medieval peasant households. Workers' tenements in Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, the great industrial cities of the British Isles, were densely packed, poorly ventilated, and chronically damp. Multiple families might share a single room. Beds were shared in shifts, the night shift worker sleeping in a bed still warm from the day shift worker who had just vacated it. These arrangements were called hotbeds, and they were common enough to be unremarkable. The disruption to the two-sleep pattern that had governed European nights for centuries is believed to have occurred during this period. The industrial clock imposed a single, consolidated block of sleep, not because human biology had changed, but because the factory schedule left no room for a waking interlude in the middle of the night. You worked until you were exhausted. You slept until you had to be awake again. The rich complexity of the pre-industrial night was flattened into a simple equation of labor and recovery. By the time Thomas Edison introduced the practical incandescent electric bulb in 1879, the cultural shift was already well underway. Electricity made artificial lighting cheap and ubiquitous in a way that gas lighting never had. Within a generation, electric light had moved from novelty to necessity in urban homes across the industrialized world, and with it came the final, decisive severing of the human sleep cycle from the natural patterns of light and dark that had governed it for the entire history of the species. The first generation to sleep primarily under artificial light was the first generation to begin suffering from what we now recognize as modern sleep disorders in significant numbers. Insomnia, not as an occasional affliction, but as a chronic condition, began appearing in medical literature with increasing frequency from the late 19th century onward. The complaints are recognizable:
difficulty falling asleep, waking in the night, feeling unrested in the morning. The sense that sleep had become adversarial and complicated rather than natural and simple. The industrial age did not invent sleeplessness. It created the conditions in which sleeplessness could become epidemic. It separated sleep from the rhythms of the natural world. It imposed external scheduling on a process that had evolved for hundreds of thousands of years to be governed by internal biology. And it taught an entire civilization to feel guilty about the desire to sleep, to see rest as a competitor to productivity rather than its precondition. We are still living in the shadow of that lesson, but knowing its history, knowing that it is recent and imposed and not natural, is the first step towards gently, patiently releasing it. Your desire to sleep tonight is not laziness. It is biology. It is your body asking for what it has always needed, and you can give it freely.
For the vast majority of human beings who have ever lived, sleep was not something that could be managed or optimized in isolation from everything else. It was entirely embedded in the cycle of agricultural work, in the turning of the seasons, in the length of daylight hours that varied dramatically from midsummer to midwinter. The sleep of a medieval or early modern peasant was not a constant daily event. It was a living, shifting, seasonal practice. More sleep in winter, less in summer, the body expanding and contracting with the light. Consider winter first, because winter is where the story of pre-industrial sleep is most extraordinary. In Northern Europe, think England, France, Germany, Scandinavia, a midwinter night could last 15 or 16 hours. Sunset came in mid-afternoon, sunrise came mid-morning, and in between there was simply darkness, cold, and very little to do. A peasant who had been working in fields since before dawn all summer might, in the deep of winter, sleep for 10, 11, even 12 hours. Historians and anthropologists who have studied this period speak of a kind of hibernation tendency in pre-industrial winter populations, not the true hibernation of bears or dormice, but a genuine biological downregulation of activity, metabolism, and wakefulness in response to cold and darkness. People ate less in winter because less food was available. They moved less because the fields were frozen and the roads were impassable. They kept to their homes, gathered around the fire, and slept in quantities that would alarm a modern person. The two-sleep pattern that we discussed in the medieval section was particularly pronounced in winter. First sleep after a very early evening, a waking interlude in the deep cold middle of the night, perhaps to tend the fire, perhaps to pray, perhaps simply to lie quietly in the dark and think. Then second sleep until the late winter dawn. Historians have found references to this interlude used for all sorts of activities that would seem strange to us. Visiting. It was not unusual for a person to dress in the middle of the night, walk to a neighbor's house, and spend an hour in quiet conversation before both parties returned to their second sleep. The midnight hours in close rural communities were social time of a particular kind. Intimate, unguarded, slightly dreamlike in quality. There were no performances to maintain, no hierarchies to observe. There was just the dark and the cold and the firelight and the trusted neighbor. Summer was almost the opposite experience. In midsummer at the latitude of central England, the sun set late and rose early, leaving a window of darkness of only 5 or 6 hours. The body, responding to this abundant light, was awake more, slept less, and the sleep that did occur tended to be concentrated in a single block. Agricultural work intensified in summer. This was a season of planting, of tending, of harvest preparation, and exhaustion drove sleep regardless of the hour. People fell asleep where they were sometimes, in the field, under a tree, in a hayloft, the body simply taking what it needed when the opportunity arose. The nap, the afternoon rest that we saw in Rome as a cultural institution, was even more practical in agricultural life.
The period between noon and 2 was genuinely the hottest and most energy-depleting time of day, and laborers resting through it were not being lazy. They were being practical. A laborer who rested in the midday heat could work longer into the cooler evening than one who pushed through and collapsed earlier. Rest was strategy. Sleep was a tool of survival. What strikes me most about seasonal sleep is how deeply it was connected to community. When everyone's schedule was governed by the same light and the same crops and the same cold, sleep was synchronized. The village went quiet at roughly the same time. It woke at roughly the same time. The rhythm of rest was collective in a way that is almost impossible to imagine in modern life, where one household's occupants might be on entirely different schedules, where a night shift worker sleeps while their neighbors are having breakfast, where teenagers drift toward midnight and the elderly wake before 5. There was also the church bell. In virtually every village in medieval and early modern Europe, the church occupied the center, and its bell organized time for the entire community. It rang for the canonical hours, the structured periods of prayer that divided the day. It rang for services, and it rang in the deep night for matins, that prayer in the interlude between first and second sleep, its sound traveling out across the dark fields and cold rooftops into the sleeping village, orienting everyone to the same moment in the turning night. Let that image settle. The bell in the dark, the sleeping village, the fire dying in every hearth, the snow on the fields or the summer grass silver in dew and moonlight. Thousands of people sleeping in the same rhythm, under the same sky, in the same cold or the same warmth, as connected in their unconsciousness as they were in their waking hours. There is something in that image that feels like belonging, like being held by something larger than yourself, like rest that is also a form of home.
Before we close, let us look at the room you are in right now, or the room whose darkness you are currently inhabiting. Because the bedroom, the private sleeping space, the dedicated room for the sole purpose of rest, this is a surprisingly young invention, and its history is more complicated and more interesting than you might expect. The idea that sleep should happen in a separate room, behind a closed door, away from the rest of the household's activity, is not ancient. In most of human history, and in many cultures around the world today, sleep happens wherever the people are, in the main room, around the fire, in a shared space with multiple generations, on a raised platform or a mat on the floor of a room that also serves as kitchen, dining room, living room, and workspace. The separate bedroom began to emerge in wealthy European households in the late medieval period, but it was initially not a private space in the modern sense. A nobleman's bedchamber was a semi-public room in which guests were received, business was conducted, and advisors and servants moved freely. The bed itself was a ceremonial object as much as a functional one. The ritual of the king's lever, the formal ceremony of the French monarch arising from bed in the morning, attended by dozens of courtiers who considered it an honor to be present at this moment, tells you everything you need to know about how differently the bedroom functioned in pre-modern aristocratic life. The shift toward genuine bedroom privacy happened gradually through the 17th and 18th centuries as domestic architecture began to incorporate corridors, hallways that allowed movement between rooms without passing through each other, and as the emerging middle class developed both the physical space and the cultural values that made private rooms possible and desirable. By the Victorian era, the private bedroom had become not just a physical space, but an ideological one, a retreat from the public world, a space of vulnerability and intimacy, separated from the rest of life by a door that was genuinely and meaningfully closed. The Victorian bedroom was a heavily furnished and carefully managed space. Thick curtains blocked the morning light. Heavy carpets absorbed sound.
The bed was a substantial wooden structure with a mattress of horsehair or wool springs, covered with multiple layers of linen and blankets, and in colder climates, a thick eiderdown. The room contained the tools of personal hygiene, the washstand, the chamber pot, because the bathroom as a separate room had not yet fully arrived. Wealthy households had separate dressing rooms. More modest ones made do with wardrobes and the space under the bed. Central heating was rare and unreliable in Victorian homes. The bedroom was heated, if at all, by a small fireplace that would be lit in the evening and banked down before sleep, leaving the room to grow cold through the night. A hot water bottle, a stoneware or later rubber container filled with boiling water, was placed in the bed before the sleeper got in, warming the sheets in the spot where the body would soon be. This device, humble as it is, represents a meaningful improvement in the quality of sleep for the millions of people who used it through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Shared beds were still common in Victorian households of modest means. Children often shared beds with siblings. 2, 3, 4 children per bed was not unusual in working-class homes where space was limited. Domestic servants slept in attic rooms, often several to a room, on narrow iron-frame beds that were functional and nothing more. The single-occupant bedroom, with its implication of space and privacy and individual comfort, was a middle-class aspiration and an upper-class expectation, but for the majority of the population, it remained just that, an aspiration. The 20th century democratized the bedroom in a way that no previous era had. Mass production made furniture affordable. Electric heating made climatic comfort possible. The decline in household size, fewer children, fewer servants, fewer extended family members under one roof, meant that individual rooms became available for individual people. And the growing psychological and medical literature about sleep from the early 20th century onward increasingly emphasized the importance of the sleep environment. A dark room, a quiet room, a cool room, a clean room with good air circulation. And here we are, in the room you are in right now. A room designed, or at least used, primarily for the purpose of sleep. A room with a door that closes, with a bed that, if you're lucky, is yours alone or shared only with someone you have chosen, with temperature control and light control, and the ability to create, at the touch of a switch or the tap of a screen, something approximating the conditions that the human body has been seeking for its sleep since the very beginning: darkness, quiet, warmth, and safety. The people who came before you would find this room extraordinary, the privacy of it, the quiet of it, the softness. And in this extraordinary room, in this space of unimaginable historical luxury, you can do the oldest and most necessary thing that human beings do. You can simply rest.
We have traveled a long way tonight. From the first fire-lit camps where your ancestors pressed together against the cold and the dark, through the sacred nights of ancient Egypt, through the philosophical bedrooms of Greece and Rome, through the two-part sleep of the medieval world and the feared darkness of every era, through the harvest rhythms and seasonal surrenders of agricultural life, through the disruptions of the industrial age and into the carefully managed private bedroom of the modern world. We have covered thousands of years and dozens of cultures, and all of it, every bit of it, has been about this same thing that you are doing right now. Sleep is the one constant. The body that wants to sleep tonight is the same body, running the same ancient software that curled around the fire in an open landscape 100,000 years ago. No amount of artificial light or alarm clock scheduling or late-night screen use has changed the fundamental biology. Your circadian rhythms still respond to darkness with melatonin. Your core body temperature still drops as sleep approaches. Your brain still moves through the same cycles of light and deep sleep and dream sleep that it would have moved through in a medieval peasant's thatched cottage. The body does not know what century it is. It only knows what the light says, and what the day has cost, and what the night is offering.
What I find most moving about all of this history is how much of it has been about permission. Every culture, in every era, in one way or another, developed frameworks for giving people permission to let go. The Egyptian priest who carved Bes into the headboard was saying, "You are protected, you can close your eyes." The medieval prayer before sleep was saying, "You have done what you can do. The rest is not your responsibility tonight." The Islamic guidance about when to sleep and how to prepare was saying, "Care for this body, honor its need for rest." This too is an act of faith. Even the Victorian hot water bottle was saying, "Here is warmth, here is comfort, here is a small act of preparation that signals to the body that it is time." You need that permission too. Perhaps you have been fighting it all evening, the list of things not yet done, the thoughts circling without resolution, the low-level anxiety that modern life maintains as a kind of background noise that can make genuine rest feel like something you have not yet earned. The history we have walked through tonight says something important to that feeling. You have always been allowed to rest. In every era, in every culture that thought carefully about this, rest was not a reward for completion. It was a necessity that preceded the ability to continue. You rest because you need to rest. That is sufficient. The medieval monk who rose from first sleep in the deep cold dark of 2 in the morning to stand in the chapel and pray was not doing it because his work was finished. The work was never finished. He was doing it because the night had its own rhythm and he had made peace with moving through it rather than against it. The Hadza woman who falls asleep 3 hours after sunset beneath a sky blazing with stars that no city dweller will ever see is not doing it because her to-do list is empty. She is doing it because the fire is low, and her body knows the signal, and she has learned to trust what her body knows. Trust what your body knows tonight. It has been doing this for longer than you can imagine. It has carried you through every single night of your life without your conscious supervision. While you have been busy with everything else, your body has been cycling through sleep stages, consolidating memories, repairing tissue, regulating hormones, doing the deep maintenance work of being alive. It knows how to do this. You do not need to manage it. You only need to get out of the way. Somewhere tonight, on the other side of the world from where you are, another person is just waking into their morning. The sun is coming up for them as it goes down for you. The whole planet is always doing this, always half in light and half in dark, always spinning through the ancient cycle that has governed every life that has ever been lived on its surface. You are one small warm point in that endless rotation. Your rest is your participation in it. So let your eyes close now if they haven't already. Let the sounds of the room become background, just texture, just atmosphere, just the ordinary sounds of a world that is doing fine without your attention for the next few hours. Let the thoughts that are still moving begin to slow, the way a stream slows when it reaches still water. Let them slow and spread and finally stop moving entirely. You have been awake long enough today. You have done enough, thought enough, managed enough. The night has taken over from the day, as it always does, as it always will. And the oldest, wisest, and most consistent advice that every culture in human history has ever given about this moment is simply this: let go. The dark is safe. The dark has always been safe. Let yourself go into it now, slowly, the way your ancestors did, the way every person who has ever lived has eventually, inevitably, and gratefully done. Good night.